Welcome to Cause and Effects ABCs of Disability series, where we highlight the problems facing the disability community and find solutions to those problems. As you know, this season is about autism. But before we jump in on those conversations and share specialized information with all our parents, we want to introduce you to the law in this town. Because context is everything in shedding light on how persons with disabilities can access their healthcare, education, employment, and even transportation needs, and enjoy an acceptable quality of life here in Trinidad and Tobago. Mrs. Ria Mohammed-Davidson, attorney at law, has already shared in episodes 1 and 2 that we don't have holistic disability legislation. What we do have are individual pieces of legislation that seemingly touch on disability issues. This is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities document, the first treaty of the 21st century. Trinidad and Tobago signed in 2007 and ratified in 2010 this 37-page document. The very first item in the preamble, A, states, recalling the principles which recognize the inherent dignity and worth and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And E, recognizing that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairment and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. We can't go through the entire document here, but this is to give you an idea of the premise upon which the treaty was built.
Is a fact, strictly facts, from front or the back.
We asked Ria, is the state obligated to implement the articles of the UNCRPD document? And if they fail to do so, are there any legal ramifications for our country?
So Trinidad and Tobago would have both signed and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that is really a historic human rights document because it's the first treaty of the 21st century. It's also the first treaty that deals with disability issues in a holistic way. The implication of us ratifying the treaty means that the treaty is binding on us in international law. But because Trinidad and Tobago, our legal system is what is called a dualist state, once we sign a treaty and we ratify it, in order for that treaty to have effect in our domestic legal system, it has to be incorporated into our domestic laws. So that the ratification alone is not sufficient. What has to happen now is that the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and the legislature has to actually pass a law that is going to enable those treaties, that treaty and the articles of those treaties to become legally enforceable and binding law in this jurisdiction.
But is the UNCRPD fixed and binding across all signatories? Or is it dependent on the signatories' economic ability to implement?
Well, and that's the interesting thing. Because we are a dualist system, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So there are jurisdictions that are not dualists. Civil law countries, for example, that once they sign a treaty and they ratify it, it is binding and it's part of their laws. It's a little bit more complex for that. So there is a two-stage process that we have to go through. So the ratification of the treaty on its own, all that does is make it binding in international law. And states have a responsibility to honor their obligations under international law. The problem, though, is that yes, the CRPD will talk about things like education and inclusive education. And you know that that does not happen in the way that it is supposed to in Trinidad and Tobago. But a litigant or a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago cannot sue the state in Trinidad and Tobago for breaching its obligations under the CRPD. And the reason why they can't do that is because the CRPD has not become an act or a law in Trinidad and Tobago. So we've gone far enough for it to become binding in international law. Now we need to do some further work for it to become binding in our domestic legal system.
We learned that Trinidad and Tobago signed and ratified the UNCRPD document, the first treaty of the 21st century that also deals with disability in a holistic manner. We learned that we can sign on to any treaty we want. However, we also learned that our legal system is what is called a dualist state, which means that in order for any treaty or articles of that treaty to become legally enforceable and binding, it must be incorporated into our domestic laws. Join us in episode 4 of Cause and Effects ABCs of Disabilities series, The Law and Disabilities, when Ria tells us where we've reached with incorporating this treaty into our domestic laws. If you like this content, give it a like and share it across all your contacts and all your networks. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our pages, Cause and Effect, a very special disabilities forum, and our YouTube page. Until then, keep your light on, mask up, sanitize, and keep your distance.
And it's that